10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And we are live. Good evening, Kat. How are you?
I'm wonderful, Juanita. How are you?
I am doing so well. It's lovely to be back here with you at, I believe you called it Stage Blunt. And this evening,
I don't know any other way to be at this point. And honestly, the problems we're talking about are too serious not to talk plainly about, right? You know, I mean, I try to inject my personality when I can. I love humor as much as anybody, but when we talk about suicide prevention, we have to get real.
We have to get real. We have to be blunt. We have to discuss the difficult topics. Yes. And, you know, there's no better way to minister to someone out there that's really going through that than to just do that, to talk about the important things and the difficult subjects. So I'm enjoying this journey that we are on. And I believe this evening we are going to be discussing demystifying intuition amongst other things. So I hand over to you.
Thank you. Yeah. So the whole last month, we talked a lot about intuitive eating and related topics, right? And I wanted to start there because it is the foundation upon which I built this new understanding, both personally and professionally, of what intuition even means, right? You hear that word a lot. Some people refer to that as your gut feeling, which is interesting because it's more of a third eye phenomenon. But, but your gut, if you will, the solar plexus is your emotional center, right? So, and your emotions very much relate to your intuition, although they have a more inverse quality. So we'll get there. But yes. But I wanted to just build upon, as we move into a new month, less of the eating piece of this, right? Because you can go back, and I hope you do, and view hours at this point of content in regards to what intuitive eating is, the principles of intuitive eating, and to put it as simply as I can, it's a process specific to eating of getting back in touch with your body's natural signals. Your natural hunger, your natural fullness signals, the ability for your body, when exposed to a wide variety of food, to really hone in on which food groups are most needed in that moment. And we see that with children, because children are born intuitive eaters, right? Most children are born intuitive eaters. So unless we teach them dieting, which is an unnatural process, they maintain that intuition. And you'll see a baby not just, cry for the bottle or the breast when it's hungry and push the bottle or breast away when it's full. But as they move into toddlerhood and eating solid foods, when the parent is able, privileged, if you might, to provide a large variety of healthy foods, and even what we call fun foods, right? You'll see the child gravitate towards a very balanced diet over the course of a week. Now, that week is important because some people would say, oh, no, my child ate nothing but carbs yesterday. My child ate nothing but chicken nuggets the day after. But if you look in the course of a week, that child is seeking out and getting its nutrients. So, we really should just all follow the baby's leads. That's my understanding.
They are clever and they are intuitive.
As a mom, I mean, let's just let them sit back and take this over. I say kids are the teachers, we're the tour guides.
Yes, I love that.
Right. So specific. And I started that process for myself in 2015, which is 8 years ago at this point. Right. And it took months. I'm going to say months. And in many ways, I'm still in the process of healing my relationship with movement, because I had a very, very unhealthy, even toxic relationship to exercise prior. It's now just at the point where my life stress is getting to the point where I can start thinking more about gentle nutrition and what that means for my body. So So it's a lifelong practice, right? This isn't something you jump on and then 3 months later you have the body you want. That's called a fad diet. Go ahead and, if you want to, but with warning that it's not going to work long term, right? So so I started the practice of intuitive eating in 2015. And then from there, I really let go of the idea that if I did yoga, that it had to be weight loss, because yoga held some appeal to me. I kept going back, but there was something, the fact that I was doing it for weight loss, therefore doing it in rooms that were maybe 120 degrees, that I would literally feel sick just being in that heat, or, around people who were so much stronger and more flexible than I even aspired to be, right? For instance, I'm very afraid of heights, so handstand does not appeal to me in any way, shape, or form, right? So
I hear you. Yeah.
So I let go of the idea that yoga specifically had to be for weight loss, and I started doing it for inner peace, right? I started doing it to feel better. And the specific types of yoga, very gentle forms of yang yoga, nothing that you're really going to break a sweat with. You're just moving your body along with your breath. And then also more of a challenge for me was yin yoga, which is largely still. It's essentially a 60-minute meditation, or however long the class is, but it's done in different shapes. And they're long held poses, usually that are getting you to some sort of edge, meaning any more would be too much, but any less is holding back, right? So that's individual for each person. Teaching you how to, because we don't do yoga to get better at yoga. We do yoga to get better at life. It's a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And part of this exploration of the edge is to get you to the edge of your comfort zone, right? Because that's the only place growth occurs, is outside of your comfort zone, right? So these practices were really foundational. And yoga teaches, it's a mindfulness, for a form of mindfulness, right? What you're learning is the practice of mindfulness, or the art of mindfulness. And even though I was just thinking about intuition in the form of eating, because at that time I was still an atheist. I was an atheist for 18 years of my life. From 21 years old, when my father passed away, my Catholic faith died with him. And then I'm talking about into my late 30s, mid to late 30s. 38 is when I had a spiritual awakening. And I'm talking now about the process that led up to that. So intuitive eating was the first piece of that. And now that I started doing yoga, and I was opening my mind, not necessarily to spiritual concepts, but Buddhist concepts really appealed to me. I believe Buddhism is referred to as advanced logic or something like that. There's adages such as, or teachings, I should say, such as pain is inevitable in life, but suffering is a choice, right? And those types of teachings started to make sense to me. So I was kind of just exploring the principles of yoga on a deeper level, but mostly I was just interested, especially as a physical therapist, why 1 hour or so of concentrating on my breathing, and maybe in sometimes manipulating that breath and making it deeper or louder or more forceful, but sometimes literally just observing my breath was making me feel so much better than Xanax and alcohol and other things that I was using to manage my anxiety that weren't nearly as healthy. And I knew that, right? So I became really curious enough to become a yoga teacher, right? I went through the program and a 200-hour teaching program at the end of 2016. And I did not do that because I thought I was on a spiritual path. I really just wanted to understand why breathing was making me feel better, understand the physiology of that. I wanted to incorporate that knowledge into my physical therapy work. And the first name of my company at that time, now it's called Compassionate Healing Services. But when I first started, it was just called Zen Mom Yoga, because that's what I thought I would do. I thought I would teach yoga to fellow stressed out moms. And I never saw going any further than that. But I remember at the time, I had a wonderful teacher named Alexander Schimmel, and who was 10 years younger than me, by the way. And so I thought that was especially interesting that he was such a wise teacher, right, when he was so young. And I remember saying to him once, you know, it's interesting, Alex, when you teach us to meditate and to go into these poses, I feel like what you're saying is that we should let go of thought, right? You know, that we're being
constant self. Yeah.
Right. We're practicing how to observe our thoughts without letting them take over, right? You're not trying to control your thoughts so much as you're not letting them control you, right? And that practice was very helpful and it resonated for me. But what I found was once I was really in that place where in the middle of the yoga class, where I felt really relaxed and I felt really peaceful and I felt really just in that now moment, I wasn't worried about anything to come or anything that had happened. I would get these downloads or just kind of flashes of insight that felt so
powerful,
helpful and powerful, and like, wow, I never thought about that. I never thought that I could look in that situation in that way or do that particular thing about that problem that I had. And I even remember going up to him after one class and being like, am I doing something wrong? Because I'm letting go of thought, but then thought comes, right? And it's really it's powerful and it's helpful. And I kind of remember, you know, he just kind of smiled and was like, if it feels good, it's good, right? You know, I mean, don't overthink it, you know? So that was maybe my first clue that there was more to this intuition thing, right? And I stayed on the path of yoga. I became a yoga teacher. It was after I was already a yoga teacher, though, that I had my suicidal crisis. I started my business in January of 2017, Zen Mom Yoga, as I said. By March of 2017, I had the 6-day manic episode that caused me to have a bipolar diagnosis. And from April through that summertime, I was suffering deeply with depression so bad, partly because of these mood stabilizers they were insisting I take that were, in my case, the symptoms and the side effects were worse than the symptoms they were trying to treat. And I was also being bullied at that time by my best friends of 20 years. So I had a narcissistic best friend, and I know that. And that was a battle literally for my life between those two factors. So as I was suffering so incredibly deeply with my depression, you know, I was leaning on concepts such as eating intuitively. I was leaning on my yoga background. I was taking on more skills such as dialectical behavior therapy, which is rooted in mindfulness. A lot of people don't know that Marsha Linehan, the creator of DBT, not only did she suffer herself, as I did, very deeply with mental illness. This wasn't something she read about in her textbooks, although she did receive a PhD in her professional life after her suffering as a teenager with chronic suicidal ideation, you know, attempts, so severe that she was isolated in a psych ward for 2 years. And she left, you know, she said essentially to herself, well, they tried their best, right? They, you know, kind of like me, I went through all of the talk therapies. I went through EMDR. I went through a partial hospitalization program. I was taking all of their medications and I was getting worse instead of better. And kind of like me, she said, well, they tried their best and they didn't help me. So I guess I need to help myself. And while, yes, she did get a PhD, she also had a spiritual awakening of her own.
Wow.
And she describes it as she was sitting in a church and she was praying and meditating. The way I put it is prayer is how you ask and meditation is how you listen for the answer.
Love that.
And all of a sudden, and I hope I'm recalling this correctly, she said when she opened her eyes, the entire church was just glittering gold, like in the most beautiful, you know, the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. And she said shortly after, she walked up to a mirror and she looked herself in the face and she said, I love you. And that was the very first time she ever said that to herself. And how powerful is that? Because we're talking about a woman who went from suffering so deeply in her teens to now she's in her 70s, I believe. She hasn't taken any medication for mental illness in decades. And everything that she came up with was, she also spent, I believe, 8 months in a Buddhist ashram, right? So she combined all of these experiences, that of her own suffering. This sounds so familiar for me, right? She combined that of her own suffering with the fact that nothing that was currently available was helping.
Yeah.
And she opened her mind and her heart to this idea that she was lovable, that she maybe was made of love, that she was loved and known by a force much greater than herself, right? And we call that force, God, but, even the faith that I came from, Catholicism, we do believe they believe there's one God, right? I also believe there's only one source of energy, and I don't think it's denominational. I don't think it's favoring the Catholics over the Jews, right? This is the energy in which we all come from, and it's the energy of which we are connected to. And our intuition after my spiritual awakening, what I came to understand was that intuition, what I was calling, this innate wisdom that my body could tell me, just when to eat, how much to eat, what categories of food to eat, not to become thin, mind you, but for health, for what's best for my body, right? And then I built upon this with this yoga practice of, well, it's interesting when I actually do these mindfulness practices, when I let go of that 70% of my brain that cared about what I weighed and how much I was eating, right? That was a huge chunk of brain power to take back. And I started really caring much more about how I felt than how I looked, right? And opening my mind and heart to things that I had previously thought ridiculous or woo or crazy, whatever label you want to call it. And I started practicing these things on a daily basis, not just intellectualizing them. And as I said in the yoga classes, all of a sudden I felt like I had almost a helpful wisdom, wise voice inside of my being, telling me, whispering to me what I could do next if I relaxed, if I let go of all that stress, right? And then I went through 14 months of DBT skills training, which even though I still was an atheist and I still was, I remember hearing that story about Marsha Linehan and thinking like, oh, that's weird. Like it's weird that she thought she was seeing glittery gold in a church. I don't believe that, but it did resonate for me that she found self-love, right? Because, that's not something you need to be in search of a God, to be in search of how to love yourself on a deeper level, or maybe for the first time ever, like in my case. And so as I built upon, and I practiced and I didn't push away and resist what was working for me, whether other people understood it or liked it or liked me as a result of it. I just kind of let go of all of that. And it was though it still took a very shocking experience, which was in 2018, specifically November 7th, 2018, I attended a spirit medium workshop that was being offered at my yoga studio because I was very angry that somebody would claim to be able to speak to the dead, right? Because I was an atheist in large part because all of the death that I experienced, not just the birth, but not just the death of my father, but I believe it was something along the lines of 13 very close family members and friends in a 16-year period. It was a very constant thing that happened in my childhood. And between that and all our prayers, quote, not working, right, to keep these people in our lives, and then at the same time, when I turned 21 in the year 2000 was around the time that the Catholic pedophilia revelations came out, and those two factors were enough for me to turn my back completely to the Catholic Church and what I thought was the only option of God at that time. And I became very, very staunchly scientific, right? It was, if you couldn't
prove it with science, it wasn't true.
Exactly. And I lived in that space for a very long time, as I also concurrently suffered, right? And was using a lot of alcohol and other unhealthy ways of coping. And what happened on November 7th, 2018 was, when I walked into that space to try to prove him wrong, he did the opposite, right? Between his charming, disarming, nature, I mean, he was just a very nice, kind, young man, younger than me. When we touched hands, he said, "Wow, do you do Reiki?" And I looked at him skeptically and I said, "No, I'm a physical therapist and a yoga teacher." And he said, "No, you're a healer that could do what I do." And I said, "Okay." And I walked into the yoga room and I sat down. Luckily, they had it set up like a yoga class because I had props and things to work with. Because the moment he walked into the room, after his assistant said, "Mitch is going to pray to the angels and he'll come in to channel for you," my eyes were rolling in the back of my head. But when he walked in the room, it was the very first time I felt energy in that intense way, where it felt like the crown chakra just opened up and a shower of energy came flooding into my body and being. And when he would move closer to me, I would sweat, and he would move away from me, I would shiver. And then he told a very relatable story about his own struggles with mental health and addiction, until he came across mediums who said that, you're special and you could, you're going to understand this about yourself very soon. And then he had a rapid spiritual awakening. And that was before he channeled for any of us. And in that room, for about 20 of us, for every single person, myself included, he channeled our supposedly physically deceased loved ones so accurately, with such specificity and such detail, that for me and every other person in that room, I left with absolutely no question that this man had a gift, that he could connect with the energy of my father, who was so clearly still my father. Yes, he didn't have a body anymore, but he had a personality, and he had his personality, and he had his memories, and he had knowledge of my life over the past 18 years that Mitch could not have known, right? So it was a life-changing, transformational awakening for me, in which I left there knowing that not only was I wrong about this atheism thing, I was also wrong about my own gifts. And maybe what I was calling mental illness, and maybe the reason I was suffering so badly, is that I too was gifted. And then it took me maybe a day to remember that I had had a very psychic experience when I was 6 years old, in which my brother and I were both at a dentist's office, but I was done earlier because he had forgotten about the appointment and come back with his bike. And I did not want to leave him, even though my brother didn't, and I didn't get along at all. He was my bully at that time and for the rest of my childhood. So it wasn't like I liked spending time with the guy, but I just could tell that something bad was going to happen. I had this feeling in my body of such certainty that something bad was going to happen. And he dismissed me and sent me home. And I walked into my house at that time, and my grandmother asked me what was wrong because I was crying, and I said, "Kevin's going to get hurt." And within 10 minutes, maybe 20, we had a call that my brother had a really bad bike accident, and that he had flipped over the handlebars and nearly severed his ear. He had something like 70 stitches were required. And it was a big deal. And I knew something was going to happen, and no one ever mentioned it again, right? It wasn't something that really went onto my family's radar as something that they should look into.
Yeah.
And that caused me over my lifetime a lot of suffering, right? Which is why I'm so passionate about helping kids today who know, or their parents know, they're gifted, and not gaslighting them out of that knowing, That is the correct term for that. When you are denying somebody else's experience, you are gaslighting them. And that is
very, very bad.
So it's something that really needs to be addressed.
I agree. Our children have an open channel, I'd call it.
Yeah.
They have a very strong intuition. And I grew up in a family of intuitives. My grandmother was incredibly intuitive, and she used to have those feelings that certain things would happen. And actually, something happened to me this week. We've always been in that flow. My mom, my grandmother, I've always been in that flow. And this week I went to town, and my plans were as follows. I was going to go to the hardware store, get a certain cable that I needed here at the office, and then go to another meeting, and then come back home. Silly illustration, but this is how intuition works for me. in various magnificent ways. And I decided in the shop while I was standing there, something just told me, don't go to the meeting, go home first and drop the cable off for the technician. And I kept, I was like, no, I have a meeting. And I was like, that intuition was stronger and it said, go home and drop the cable off first. And I listened because that's what I normally do. I just go with the flow. You'll hear me say a lot of things, this a lot. I always say, I don't control the waves, I ride them. So I said, well, I'm riding the wave of this afternoon. And I drove home. And my son was with me, and as I came around the corner on my way to the office, here my dog just got out. There was a storm brewing, and my dog was running down the road. And he noticed my car, and I opened the door and he jumped in, and I said, so that's why I wasn't supposed to go to the meeting first. That's why I was dropping the cable off now. And
I love that example.
Amazing. Yeah.
I love that example because it so perfectly illustrates the difference between our ego and our intuition, right? Your ego mind was trying to talk you out of it.
Yes.
Right? Your ego mind was trying to say, no, this was our plan. No, this is what we're supposed to do. No, right? And you didn't, because you know better at this point, allow your ego to do that. You let that quiet knowing. Some people call it a voice. It's a voiceless voice for me. I don't know how it is for you, but and good thing, because what do we call people who hear voices in their heads that aren't theirs? Schizophrenic, right? And we call and we give them very powerful, potent medicines to dim this gift. So for most of us, that intuition is not going to be a literal voice, but it's going to be this knowing or this impulse. Because another beautiful example of intuition that I've heard is a woman who said that, she was sitting at her desk just, typing or doing her work, and she felt a strong impulse to lean forward, and she didn't know why, but she didn't talk herself out of it. And as soon as she leaned forward, a ceiling grate fell and back of her chair, and it would have hit her head. And, and it takes, my favorite, I actually had heard this example through the teacher, Abraham Hicks. They're my favorite spiritual teacher. And their explanation for that was, it really is just your natural impulse. Whatever you naturally would do or say, or if you didn't talk yourself out of it, is that intuitive voice. And as you illustrated, and as that other example I just gave illustrated, it's in the moment guidance, right? You're not going to get, hey, next Thursday, I need you to do this. It's what's happening right now in this moment, because now is the only moment you have access to. That's why mindfulness practice is the path to your intuition. You have to become fully present now with this breath and this, feeling in your body. And I won't tease it and then not wrap it up. When I said earlier, there's an inverse relationship often between your emotions and your intuition, because your emotions, and I can speak about this perhaps next live in more depth, your emotions are your representation of your ego thoughts. So when your ego thoughts are really, well, let's also use the itty bitty shitty committee, right? Our messaging. So what we're calling the ego mind could also be called the itty bitty shitty committee, right? Right? When that voice of fear is loud, right, and it's chattering away, you are feeling emotions that really reflect that, right? And I'll go into the science of that. I'm going to call it a science, or the conceptualization of that next live, because we're running out of time here. But your emotions are your most sophisticated indication, if you will, of where your ego self is vibrating, because your soul self is always vibrating at the highest frequency of unconditional love. You can't ever disconnect from that. Your soul self is love. It's vibrating with and at unconditional love. Therefore, your ego mind is the variable factor, right? So when you're feeling strong negative emotion, or emotion that feels uncomfortable to you, that you don't want to feel, that's not your intuition, that's your ego. right? If you're feeling passion, if you're feeling enthusiasm, if you're feeling joy, then follow those emotions towards where it's leading, because that's your intuition. But when you feel crappy, even if you have a strong, let's say you feel really crappy and you have a strong impulse to punch someone in the face, that might be an impulse, but it's not your intuition speaking. Right? So, and that's so helpful to know, right? Because
great guideline. Yeah.
Even as someone who's been very spiritually awakened since 2018 and actively seeking out trainings and certifications in this work, applying it not just to my own life, but to that of my family, and my partner specifically suffers deeply with mental health issues from severe trauma. She's a human trafficking survivor. And applying these concepts to help my clients, so I've been in this work, right? So even as someone very spiritually aware, there are times where I've followed my ego impulses straight to a giant mess, right? Because I'm a human being. And and I attracted some really challenging circumstances that I had to work through in order to get to this more pure place where I can trust the thoughts and the impulses and the energies, because I'm no longer ruled by my ego, right? I know how to control my mind so it's not controlling me, right? I know what it feels like to be in alignment versus what it feels like not to be in alignment, and therefore what I should and shouldn't do when I'm in those spaces.
That's the truth, and it's all about letting go. It's all about releasing that power that we so desperately want to hold on, and just saying, I'm just going to go with my day, and I'm going to follow my intuition, and I'm going to keep my ego in check. And I
love your visual of I don't make the waves, I ride them. That's so perfect. It's another perfect representation of what it feels like to be in the flow of your intuition, right? And there are going to be times, oftentimes, maybe all the time, where your logical mind doesn't understand, right? Why don't we end on one beautiful example of intuition? Because it was so powerful when I heard it. There was I forget where I was reading the story, but it was a story of a person who, was, someone who didn't question or, was obedient to the guidance that was being given. And the guidance was to go to a parking lot and do a headstand. And it made absolutely no sense to the person who was following that intuitive hit. Why the hell would I go to a parking lot and do a headstand? But clearly this person didn't have the fear of heights I have, and had the capability of doing a headstand. So they did it. And when they did that, a person came out of the restaurant or whatever it was, sobbing, and came straight up to them and said, I was going to go home and take my own life. And I said, I made a deal with God that if you're real, if you can really hear me, I want to see somebody do a headstand. And sure enough, this person appeared out of nowhere and did one. I mean, that's the kind of power we're talking about. And you might hear those types of stories and dismiss them as, internet fairy tale, but I have had enough experiences in my life. And my teacher, Abraham Hicks, says all the time, words do not teach, experiences teach. Had enough miraculous experiences and enough experiences of my intuition leading me either to something incredible or protecting me from something. I had a recent, I mean, it was pretty scary, but I was unscathed. Within the last 2 months, there was a situation where, I left work at a very specific time, right, to go to a town I don't normally travel to because my fiance had a doctor's appointment. And, and I had this idea of, stopping for coffee, but then I didn't have enough time. And it just so happened that right where I would have made the turn to get coffee, and I decided I didn't have time, there was a terrible accident that a tractor trailer hit the car right in back of me and jackknifed just in time that my car was completely unscathed, but the 2 or 3 cars that were affected, it was a very severe accident, and it happened right behind me, and it happened at exactly where I would have turned. And my intuition told me not to stop there, not to turn. So, you know, it can lead you to, you know, heaven on earth. And it can also protect you from harm. Right. So it's well worth getting to know that voice, because I promise you have one. You it's just so natural to you, and or so buried within you under your itty bitty shitty committee that you didn't even know to name, that you can't hear it. So we'll spend a lot more time this month. You know, we won't call all of the episodes Demystifying Intuition, but that is really what we'll continue to do, because it is such an incredibly important concept.
It is. I'm loving the topics that you're bringing to the table, loving these discussions. These are the things we have to talk about. It is incredibly important. So what we are going to do is we'll be back next week, Tuesday and Thursday, with more interesting information, more wonderful topics to discuss. And of course, you're the expert in this. I'm enjoying my time with you. Thank you so much for your open spirit and enjoying this whole journey with you. Have a wonderful weekend, Kat.
You too, Juanita. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, audience. Thank you so much for watching with us, and we'll be back next week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Hi, my name is Jose Escobar, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Connected Leaders Academy. We're the #1 fastest growing community and tribe of some of the highest level entrepreneurs all around the country and around the world. We're in 36 states across the U.S., in 11 international countries, and over 240 plus members, growing every single day. And I'm honored, excited, and I'm glad to say that I'm proud to be the official sponsor of the Meticulous Moments podcast with Juanita Cap. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm excited for this journey.
Hey everybody, my name is Patrick Rude. I'm the owner of Rude Financial Services, a proud sponsor of the Meticulous Moments podcast, hosted and directed by the beautiful, strong, and intelligent Juanita Cap. I cannot tell you enough about what this woman has done with this podcast and the effect that she has had on me and all of the other sponsors and people that listen. Don't miss it.